Good afternoon. My name is Eric Knapp. I'm host for today. Our program today is Maps, Politics, and Stamps, some examples from the Middle East. It is presented by Ian Lustick. Mr. Lustig is a political scientist and specialist in the modern history and politics of the Middle East. He currently holds the Bess W. Hyman Chair in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He collects worldwide, but with emphasis on maps on stamps and politically instructive stamps. So with that, I turn it over to Ian, and
Thank you very much.
You may begin.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, Dawn. Thank you all of you for coming. It's really a pleasure to share the enthusiasm I've had for this topic. It's not common to find so many people who are interested in a topic like this. Even to find that there's such a thing as Cartophilately was astonishing to me. But at any rate, let me get started. I'm going to try to share my screen with you, and then turn on the slideshow, which okay, so you can all see the slide, I assume, right? Good. So here you have, when I was first asked to develop a presentation like this by the Delaware Stamp Club, I happened to be going through some unsorted stamps, and what do you know, I found a wonderful map stamp that I hadn't seen before, this one from Ecuador. So I decided, wow, this is just perfect for this presentation. When you look at it, you can see, well, let's compare it to a typical map of Latin America. And we see, wow, what a difference between the Ecuador's depiction of where Ecuador is and the map you might see of Latin America. Basically, a huge chunk of Peru is portrayed in the Ecuador stamp as in Ecuador. Basically, everything south and east of this line, all this area in the Amazon, is claimed by Ecuador, and on their stamps, at least on this stamp, they were happy to depict it that way. So there's a lot you can do with stamps. Not only are they beautiful with the cartography, but politically they are making statements. Because when a government puts something on a stamp, it's trying to say that whatever we're putting on this stamp is something that we here in this country don't argue about. It's like a civic virtue. It's something which everybody should understand is true. It's not politically controversial. And that tells you what it doesn't necessarily tell you what is politically uncontroversial, but it tells you what the current government at the time would like to promote as how the country sees itself and sees the world. Now, one of the things I teach about, and one of the things you have to understand quite a bit about in order to go into this kind of topic and understand what stamps are doing with maps, is to understand nationalism. We all know that nationalism is an amazingly powerful force. In its modern version, it came about basically in the mid-19th century, and has proven more resilient and more powerful as an appeal to masses of people than many other kinds of ideologies based on religion or economics. One of the puzzling things to Marxists, for example, with the outbreak of World War I, is that all these workers of different nations started killing each other instead of lining up as workers against capitalists. Well, what is nationalism? From a political science point of view, it's an identity, it's a political formula of a particular type. When we grow up, we have a particular knowledge of the places that we live in, the towns, the areas that we actually visit, and we know the people who live there. Sometimes we know them quite well. And if we live in the same place for a long time, as most people throughout history have done, most peasants, for example, they never leave their village, never leave the area around their village, they have an attachment to a place, to particular people, particular fields, boulders, forests, trees, very particular places. It's not abstract, it's very concrete. And the attachments that people form to the communities in the places that they know can be so powerful, it's almost like a family. and you might be willing to die to protect your village. Well, nationalism is something which which claims that you should be willing to die for people you've never met and for places you've never seen. You should be willing to die for what's called a terminal community. That is the biggest community you're attached to that you're willing to die for. Go into the army to defend a part of the country, a part of our nation state, which you've never visited and never will visit. And maybe there are 10, 20, 200 million people. You might know 20,000 of them. And yet you imagine this space. It's not that it's not real, but you have to imagine it in order to cathect to it. It's not the same thing as being attached to a particular place. So what stamps do with that idea of the nation state is they take that map image of that abstract space and they make it something which has emotive content for the members of the nation. So it should arouse you somehow and make you feel good to see a depiction of the shape of this space that you are ready to die for. And here's an example of many different, of 6 different stamps, 6 different countries, very typical, showing their map image of their country. These are interesting because, of course, back in the 1950s and early 60s, Pakistan was one country that included East Pakistan and West Pakistan. Now, this still says East Pakistan, but it became Bangladesh, whereas West Pakistan now is what we call Pakistan. Now, if you notice, one of the things that you can look at in this map of Pakistan is it includes this big chunk of territory up here, which is the Kashmir. Of course, India also claims that. And if you look at a stamp of India, oh, guess what? We have a map image of India right here. And you'll notice that it includes this area of Kashmir at the top of India. And that's in the news still today. Ever since 1947, Pakistan and India have been arguing about the largely Muslim area of Kashmir. Here you have what's called the Turkish rectangle, and it actually is called that. Before World War I, Turkey was the geographical center of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was one of the great powers. It fought on the Central Power side along with Austria-Hungary and Germany, and so lost World War I, and it was in decline, but as a result of the war and the rise of Turkish nationalism, which is not very different from loyalty to an Ottoman Empire, the country that we know of now became just the ethnic Turkish area of Anatolia. Now, it wasn't just Turkish, of course. Many Armenians and others and Kurds lived there, and many of them were killed in the process of trying to Turkify this, but that was called the Turkish rectangle. And you can see on this stamp from from 1940, a celebration of this shape of Turkey. Of course, no country has had fetishized itself as a map image more perhaps than Ireland. Here we have Ireland representing itself as the entire island, even though, as we know, a big chunk, 6 counties of the north of Ulster are currently still called Northern Ireland and within the technical sovereignty of the United Kingdom. Greece is obviously a beautiful stamp of Greece with its map image, including the various islands. Now, I mentioned that nationalism is an abstract idea. It's the idea of being connected to a space, not a place, but a space, is a very abstract thing. And the fact that human beings are capable of emotional cathect to a very abstract, imagined community that's millions of people large is something that was not understood for most of human history. So if it had been understood by the Romans, and if they had had mass communications, probably Rome would have turned into a gigantic national state. But it was only with mass communications and industrialization that the political ingredients to take advantage of this amazing capacity of humans to cathect to such a large and unknown population in space became understood. and was exploited rapidly by political leaders. What we see in France is a development of the idea of the French hexagon into the abstractness that corresponds to the idea of nationalism. Here you have a series of French stamps going back to the World War II period, in which what's called the French hexagon is depicted. Now, it's a hexagon if you count roughly the sides, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can see how prominent it is in these stamps about France. But down here in the more recent stamps, you can see how abstract it's become. It's really the hexagon. Of course, it was a problem when France declared that Algeria was a part of France, because it didn't fit the hexagonal shape. I'm not sure that's why France didn't completely successfully absorb Algeria, though I've actually written a couple books about that. But I note it because I find it very interesting. Now let's move to the Middle East. Now that I've given you this primer about map images, about the meaning of nationalism, and how the idea of the map image as an abstract representation corresponds to the abstractness of national appeals. Well, in the Middle East, we see that in Egypt, for example, going back into the 1950s, that you don't have a clear representation of what we think of as Egypt. And partly this is a result that these stamps are coming from a period in Egypt when it was still a monarchy. And monarchies, although they can have nationalist aspects, aren't actually nationalist, because nationalism implies that everybody in the country is equal in some way, because they're all members of the nation, whereas a monarchy really puts, or an empire takes the leadership, the kings or the emperors, and says, these are special people, much better than the rest of us. So that's a kind of tension between an imperial idea or a monarchical idea and nationalism. So in this dynasty this is Muhammad Ali from the early 19th century. This is King Farouk, the last of the Albanians to rule Egypt, the last of the Muhammad Ali dynasty. I might say that Farouk, who was overthrown in 1952 by Gamal Abdel Nasser and the military, he I should say Nasser was the first Egyptian to rule Egypt since the pharaohs, because in between, the rulers were Turks or Albanians, Circassians, dynasties that were not actually Egyptian. I want you to note a few things about these maps. Aside from the fact that in none of these maps do you see this clear map image of Egypt. Here's an image of the whole Middle East, and what's pointed to here is Ain Jalut, with the great battle in which the armies of from Egypt, led by Albanian slave soldiers, defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260. Now, I want you to see what it says here. Tomb of the Aggressors, 1957. That's referring to two things. It's referring to the fact that in 1956, the British, the French, and the Israelis attacked Egypt in the Suez War, and Nasser, with Soviet and American support, withstood the attack. And in humiliation, the British and the French had to withdraw. Eventually, the Israelis also had to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. And at that time, Nasser called Egypt the tomb of the aggressors being the British, the French, and the Israelis. Here Egypt under Nasser is going back to the Egyptian defeat of the Mongols and saying, see, we did it again. My defeat over the Israelis and the British and the French was just as wonderful, just as amazing, just as world historically important as the Egyptian defeat of the Mongols. And just notice the way these arrows are. This is coherent. This arrow is all broken up as if it just shattered in confrontation with the Egyptian armies. Here you have Muhammad Ali is one of the most interesting people of the early 19th century on world affairs. He wanted Egypt to industrialize to the extent that he would have a modern army and be able to join the ranks of the great powers. He thought that the Ottoman Empire, based in what is now Turkey, was decrepit. And with his army he actually conquered this entire area that's outlined in black, including southern portion of Turkey, and would have overthrown the Ottoman Empire had the British and the French not said, you know something, we don't want another great power. So they sent their fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean and essentially overthrew Ali's son's efforts to do this. And I'm not going to go into more detail here, but except to point out again that you have an imperial idea does not care too much about where its borders are. Its borders are never sharply defined the way a nation state says, well, here's where our nation is, and over there, those people in that territory is not part of our nation state. An empire is always ready to expand, so it doesn't want to draw very specific boundaries. I also wanted to note, see over here, the word Egypt is in English. But here you see it's in French, essentially. Of course, that's Arabic, Misr, but Egypt, in many of these stamps, you see this, Egypt with an E. That's because the French influence in Egypt was very strong. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1898, and it wasn't until the British came in the late 19th century that you start to get the British influence. But the upper classes in Egypt continued to honor their French aristocratic background, which is why the Farouk stamps still have ending in E. I also want you to note, here's a stamp showing the heroic Egyptian army marching into Gaza during the Palestine War in 1948, the war that produced the state of Israel. So this says Egypt, 15th of May, 1948. That's Israeli Independence Day. It's also the day that the Egyptians invaded Palestine. Over here, we can see that what's important to the what's here, the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. One of the reasons that you don't see Egyptian stamps clearly defining the state of Egypt is because there's a lot of, and many Egyptians traditionally think that Sudan ought to be a part of Egypt because the Nile is so important to Egypt, and it's always a danger, including today, that the Sudanese or others could dam up the Nile. So you see in this stamp the idea that there really should be a kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, and it was formally announced. It's been back and forth whether Egypt and Sudan are one country or not. Sudanese tend to say no, but here you see a stamp that highlights the rivers, not the borders. There you have the Red Sea. This is the Nile Delta, and so on. See that there's the Red Sea. That's the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so next slide. Now, if we move forward in time, we see some more in these Egyptian stamps. Here you have a kind of abstract rendering of Egypt, but not really, because this is the Dead Sea, and all this area is not Egypt. This is Saudi Arabia, this is Palestine, and we don't even have all of Egypt. This is a celebration of Nasser's revolution, July 1952, the breaking of chains. Still the stamp in Arabic, Misr, and Egypt ending in an E. Here you have a stamp highlighting Evacuation Day, when the Egyptians ordered the British out of the Canal Zone, and the map is showing that of the Canal Zone, October 1954. Again, maps of the Canal Zone. A lot of the 1956 war had to do with the desire by the British and the French to achieve control over the re-achieve control over the canal, and it was reopened. See, in 1957, after the British and the French and the Israelis withdrew, and the Egyptians were very proud of the fact that they were able to run the canal themselves. The British and the French had said the Egyptians would never be able to do such a complicated thing. Again, I want you to note that the map is not showing us Egypt as a whole. It's focusing in on something of great pride to the Egyptians, namely the Suez. Also see how that's still in French, not in English. Now, in 1958, Nasser, who articulated a national formula of pan-Arabism, the Arab countries that got their independence after World War II or after World War I, including Syria, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, they were torn between whether to see themselves as a nation of Tunisians or a nation of Egyptians or a nation of Jordanians, or are they really a nation of Arabs? And that's another reason why it's important in the Middle Eastern context to look and see what the stamps do. To what extent is a leader or a government pushing the idea of my country, called Watani nationalism, my homeland of Algeria or of Morocco or of Syria, as opposed to the whole Arab world. Now, the most important attempt to really form a kernel of a large Arab country was the United Arab Republic that Nasser more or less imposed on Syria in 1958. This says Egypt, this is Syria, this is the United Arab Republic. You see this map is in Arabic and English, not anymore French. And down here you can see that this is the Syrian version of a stamp that was also published, the identical stamp by Egypt. And what we see here, really fascinating, is there's something missing in the middle. There's the Red Sea, but what's in the middle there? Palestine. The idea is that Palestine divides us. The Zionist state of Israel has occupied most of Palestine, and it's made it impossible for us to easily unite. We have to have this bridge. Now the name of the country has changed from Egypt to the United Arab Republic, which you can see here in English, here in Arabic. Now, even though it was the United Arab Republic, it still wasn't sure what it was because Syria seceded from it. So Egypt continued to call itself the United Arab Republic in the early in 1970, even though it didn't have Syria anymore, but it did at one point reach out to include Sudan and Libya in a federation of Arab republics, a very brief political unit that existed. And here's an unusual stamp and a very rare map of it. And I again draw your attention to the prominence of the Nile River. That's what the Egyptians really care about. Here we see a map again of the Suez Canal area, but after the 1973 war, and by the way, just last week, October 6th, was the anniversary of the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War. I was actually in the Middle East, in Israel, when that attack took place. And what we see here is Sadat celebrating his army's ability to cross the canal, plant the Egyptian flag on that side of Sinai, and start a process which ultimately resulted many years later in the return of Sinai to Egyptian control. Sinai had been occupied by the Israelis, as we'll talk about later, in 1967. I wanted you to note that that Sadat cast off the name United Arab Republic and returned to an emphasis on Egypt for the Egyptians. And in the process of negotiations with Israel, he isolated himself from the Arab world pretty completely and eventually was assassinated as a result. But I'm trying to show you how on the map, on the stamps, you can see by the way the name of the country changes, how much is changing in the politics of the country. Now, I told you that one of the competing ideas for what Arabs should feel as nationalists is not their individual countries, Saudi Arabia or Sudan or Egypt, but the whole Arab world. And there is a map image for that whole Arab world. It's a famous phrase in Arabic, from the Gulf to the Atlantic, min al-Khalij ila al-Mukhit, which means from the Gulf, from the Arabian Gulf, they don't like to talk about it as the Persian Gulf, to the Atlantic Ocean, from Iraq all the way to Morocco. We're one country, one Arab world. Now, it's never been one country. There's an Arab League that includes most or all of those countries. But I want you to see how different countries have used that idea to depict this map image of an aspirational national unit called the Arab nation. Here we see a map from Iraq showing, you see that image of the Arab world from the Gulf to the Atlantic, the Republic of Iraq. Now, it's got the Iraqi flag, but and here we have Morocco. Very interesting map for two reasons. One, see how abstract it is. That's a realization of this principle that when you move to the national, you have to get abstract. So there's a rendition of the map image, which in its detail is kind of sloppy. See the way this is a very complicated, sort of sloppy, non-natural depiction of what a nation would be. But Morocco, they used an abstraction process to make it look more coherent. It's interesting for one other reason as well, because the king of Morocco conquered the Western Sahara by marching hundreds of thousands of his people into the Western Sahara. There's still a struggle going on over the fate of this area, but Morocco is incorporating. You see this area down here is the Western Sahara. It's not technically part of Morocco yet, but Morocco and most of the Arab world sees it that way. So that when you look at the different images, usually it includes the Southern Sahara, the Western Sahara, as part of the Arab world. Here's an Egyptian stamp. This is a Syrian stamp. Here's a Saudi stamp of the Arab world as a whole. Here's a Sudanese stamp showing that image. Now here's an older UAR stamp, Egyptian stamp, that does not have the Western Sahara. And there's another question, you see whether Somalia is included in it. Because at one time, when there was a lot of oil money sloshing around, some countries that normally didn't think of themselves as Arab say, hey, I'm Arab too. And the Somalis were part of that. So they said, we're Arabs, we should get some of that oil money as well from the rich Arab countries. Okay, so let's go to the next. Now, when we come to Israel, we come to a very, very different kind of case. I've told you that the Arab countries, on the whole, are sometimes not entirely enthusiastic about developing their map image, but most of the countries do, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Tunisia or Algeria. I can show you stamps that show that map image of that country. And I showed you earlier that most countries in the world, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh or Greece or Ireland, they're happy to show their map image as a regular feature on their stamps. Ecuador, I showed you, and all the Latin American countries, it's really amazing how many of their stamps have the maps of their country. But when it comes to Israel, you cannot find, at least I have never been able to find, a map of Israel on an Israeli stamp. I'm going to show you the closest thing I have found and then suggest why this is the case. Because there's certainly the case that we have nationalism in Israel. It's not Israeli nationalism, however, it is Jewish nationalism. Here is a stamp that was not issued by this state of Israel because it was issued before Israel was created officially on May 15th. That's when the last British soldier left Palestine on May 15th. But this is dated May 5th. This is a stamp put out by part of the World Zionist Organization called the Jewish National Fund, which raised money for natural resources, forestation, and for the acquisition of land to put at the disposal of Jews who wanted to settle in the country. It doesn't say Israel on it, it says Medinat HaYehudim, the state of the Jews. Karen Kayemet Israel, Jewish National Fund. The map on it is not a map that you would ever see of Israel. What is that map? This is the map of the United Nations. The United Nations in 1947 passed a partition resolution which divided Palestine into two parts. The darker area here was to be a Jewish state. The lighter area were to be the parts that would be the Palestinian Arab state. So Palestine was supposed to be partitioned. Now, the Palestinian Arab state never came into being. There was a civil war, and then there was a war between what became Israel and the Arab states around it, and that resulted in a state of Israel whose boundaries you might remember from before 1967. based on the 1967 armistice lines. This is an unusual stamp because right now, very few Israelis would want to say that they recognize the importance or the legitimacy of those UN borders. Palestinians have, over the years, said, okay, we'll accept a Jewish state in Palestine, but it has to go back to the borders that the United Nations drew. And you'll see, by the way, this is the area around Jerusalem. It is a different color altogether because the UN partition plan said that Jerusalem would be an international city and a corpus separatum. And what's important is that this Midinat HaYehudim, this stamp is celebrating the existence of a state of the Jews when Jerusalem is not a part of the state. And that would be very surprising for most Israelis to think that that would be possible. Now, this stamp is does not show the 1949 armistice lines. This stamp, an Egyptian stamp, which calls for the liberation of Palestine, does show the 1949 armistice lines. Not these lines from 47, but these lines from 1949, as a result of the end of the war. Here you have an Israeli stamp from, I think, the 1950s, celebrating the Israel bonds campaign. That is the campaign of the Israeli government to sell bonds abroad to supporters to help finance the operations of the Israeli government. Now, what's interesting is that I'm not sure what you call this piece of material attached with a perforation. It might be called a salvage. I'm not sure what it's called in philatelic language. But what's really interesting is that although a very abstract image of Israel is in the map, in the stamp itself, an image of the entire land of Western Palestine that was not ruled by the state of Israel at this time, but which aspirationally was desired by many, many Israelis who believed that Zionism and the Jewish people had the right to rule all of this land west of the Jordan. But down here, BIG stands for Bonds of the Israeli Government. It's ironic that it stands for big in English, but this is a map right here of essentially the 1949 armistice lines that shows the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank that was occupied by Jordan in 1948 and Gaza that was occupied by Egypt. So this is another one of those rare cases, and I'm going to show you one more in my last slide, in which you can see the official boundaries, the boundaries that most of the world recognizes as Israel, which is the 1949 armistice lines. But equally important is how this abstract image of what the real land of Israel was, which would be upbuilt by the state of Israel, became important after 1967. This is effectively what Israel rules today. Of course, you can find almost every Arab country has published stamps about Palestine that are pretty dramatic, vivid, brutal kinds of propaganda about the massacres, protesting against massacres of Palestinians and calling for this is an Iranian stamp, for the liberation of Palestine. So that's another way in which the map image is used, but this is an image that uses the entire map of Palestine or the land of Israel west of the Jordan, not the 1949 armistice lines. Now, for my last slide, I want to show you a first day cover that I picked up. This is a very unusual, I would say it's a collector's item, I guess, because it's from August 31st, 1967. It's just a couple months after Israel, the 1967 war, also called the Six-Day War, in which Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. It's still under its domination, I would say, or Gaza, all those territories, the West Bank, Gaza, although Gaza is also ruled by Hamas, and the Golan. But in this period, we see on the cover, not on the stamp, this is a stamp about the Israeli army, Tzahal, the Israel Defense Forces, but this is celebrating the first day of an Israeli post office inside the West Bank. And they have a depiction of the 1949 armistice lines with the West Bank highlighted, where the Israeli post offices are. And we see here, Deir Dibwan, opening day of Israeli post office, August 31st, 1967. And this is what's really interesting. Jordanian territory under military administration. That was quickly abandoned by the Israeli government, first to say that we were not going to refer to this as Jordanian territory, we'll refer to it as administered territories. And then not as the West Bank, but as Judea and Samaria, which is the only way that the Israeli government now refers to it, this area. So it's extremely interesting that how the Israeli government saw the West Bank right at the beginning. They saw it as Jordanian territory, not as Israeli territory. Now it's seen by most Israelis as Israeli territory, or it should be Israeli territory, or it should be annexed and made formally Israeli territory instead of just informally Israeli territory. And this is an example of how a stamp, in this case, not so much the stamp, but the first day cover, is evidence in ongoing arguments about what the status of this territory was, how it was seen, and when the Israeli government changed its philosophy and its public relations language about the territories that it had occupied. This last slide is the copyright for this presentation, which I was asked to attach. And now I'm looking forward to any comments or questions that you might have.